honour of presenting our third panel. Online, we will have Réaltán Ní Leannáin, who is originally from Belfast. She taught languages and later lectured in Trinity College Dublin and Queen's University. After giving up lecturing due to ill health, she reinvented herself as a fiction writer, and Cití of the Cards is her third fiction work and first novel. It was on the shortlist for Annan Fost Irish Language Book of the Year, and she presently teaches online with Galway University. Our second speaker today is Dr. Louisa Parker, aka Una. She is an artist and writer of international reputation who works from a garden shed in Leeds. Her graphic novels are Eve, Becoming, Unbecoming, Unsanity, One Day and Two Lives, and Cree. Her first book, Becoming Unbecoming, has been widely translated, adapted into a play in Brazil, and won a Le Prix Artemisia in France. She has appeared on Women's Hour on Radio 4 and Radio 3 Free Thinking. She was recently a visiting scholar at the Oxford Centre for Life Writing and is now a research associate at the Oxford Centre for Criminology. Then online again, we will have Dr. Keisha Allen, who is an assistant professor in Black and Latino Studies at Baruch College. She is the recipient of the Anne G. Wiley Dissertation Fellowship and the McGittrick Book Award. Recently, she graduated with a PhD from the Department of English at the University of Maryland. Her broad area of research is 20th century Caribbean literature, and within this field, she examines Caribbean literature by female writers who critique social and political inequalities in their societies. She interrogates society and artistic responsibility with women presented as creatively engaged in revolutionary activities aimed at reshaping ideas and perspectives on the national imagination. And in person, we have Dr. Nazia Akhtar, Assistant Professor from the Institute of Information Technology in Hyderabad. Nazia is the Assistant Professor from the Human Sciences Research Group, where she teaches courses in Indian and Russian literature. In 2017, she was awarded a New India Fellowship to write a book on Urdu prose by Hyderabadi women. Bibi's Room went on into print in July 2022. Nazia has recently received commendation from the jury of the Jawad Memorial Prize for her translation of Seneth Sajid's Urdu short story, Totem Jan. She's currently translating more Urdu writings of Hyderabadi women and conducting research on literary representations of the transfer of power as it affected Hyderabad. Thank you.
I'll just say my name is Réaltán Ní Leannáin, and this will be a brief overview of a historical novel, Cití na gCártaí, or Cití of the Cards. It starts in Birgu, which used to be a small town in Malta, and is now it's a suburb in Valletta. And Malta's an island that's halfway between Italy and the north coast of Africa. Next slide, please. And that's it, yes. So you can see there, I hope, 2 photographs of my grandmother, because it started off with memories of my grandmother, Josefina Di Felici. She was born in Malta in 1900. So the one on the left was taken in 1916 when she was 16 years old in Malta. And the second one was 1918 in Belfast. At that stage, she was married to an Irish stranger, a soldier in the British Army during the First World War, and he was stationed on the island for a while. And he liked the women there and decided he would get one when he came back home. So she ended up in Belfast in 1918, far from family, far from home, with what was a total stranger. And he had come home. He rode off back to Malta to one of the local sergeants there, who put him in touch with. They had matchmakers both in Ireland and in Malta at the time, and basically he found him a wife, and that was my grandmother. Next slide, please. So Cití started off with family members, but in the course of trying to research women's lives at that time, for me, both in Malta and Belfast, it very quickly morphed into a different story based on women and women's experiences of the time. I used my grandmother as a starting point, but Kitty is very much her own woman with her own personality and developed as a standalone character, but heavily based on what was happening to women in Belfast and throughout the whole of the island of Ireland at the time. Next picture, please. The picture on the left is women in a church in Belfast. And they're called shawlies for obvious reasons, because they wore shawls. And shawlies were considered to be very much, they would have been the lowest class of woman, because anyone who had any money at all would get a shop-bought coat rather than a shawl. The one on the right is the Maltese version of a shawlie. It's called a gonella, and it originally comes very probably from Sicily. And its object was to, again, just like the shawl, it was to cover as much of the woman as possible so that she couldn't be seen, because she had to be hidden away from the male gaze. They're very dramatic looking, the ones on the right, the gonella, you can see that. They're made of whalebone or linen or silk. And I actually went over to Malta to start researching the book. And the Maltese National Archives were very helpful to me in producing photographs for me, because obviously at that time, it was very hard to sort of put together what women's lives were, because they were not documented. There were very few written sources you could go to. So my sources were mainly photographs. And then eventually I was lucky enough, I'll talk to you later about a conference that I attended where a lot of academics had done a lot of the hard work for me. So next slide, please. This is an example of where my grandmother came from, which would have been shady, filled with lime trees, lemon trees, orange trees, and even in the streets would have been relatively clean, because horses wouldn't have gone up and down those streets. They would have in the one on the right in Belfast. But if you look at the one on the left, what it doesn't say is I actually went over to stay in one of these houses in Birgu, and I can tell you the smell of cat pee was something else. And no doubt they had as many cats. The cats would have kept down an awful lot of vermin. They wouldn't have been allowed into the house, because then they would have got up to the roof, and the roof was where they kept rabbits, because they brought up rabbits to eat because there was a lack of ground. And rabbits, apparently, they're very, very climate friendly. You can eat them all, and they don't take as much money as cows. So she went from the Sun to Belfast. On the right-hand side, that's the Pound Colony in Belfast, and that's taken during the Civil War, before the War of Independence. And if we go on to pick numbers, that's it. Yes, okay. While over there, I got to talk to Rita Saliba, who is a poet who writes in Maltese. She was very generous with her time and knowledge and opened a lot of doors for me, metaphorically speaking. We talked a lot about women at that time. We exchanged tales. We saw that women in Ireland and Malta led very similar lives. They had arranged marriages. There was strict control by the church and by the males of the household. Submissiveness and obedience was the name of the game. And I wrote Gozo into the story, courtesy of Tales from Rita. Gozo is the sister island there up on the left, slightly to the north. It is relatively rich. But for instance, if a woman became pregnant due to rape or incest or outside of marriage for any other reason that the Maltese men deemed it necessary to brush the pregnancy and the woman under the carpet, the pregnant woman was sent to Gozo to work through her pregnancy for a rich Gozitan family under the watchful eyes of the family, the rich family, and local nuns and clergy. In return, the pregnancy would be overseen by nuns, and when the child was born, it would be adopted either in Malta or neighbouring states such as Sicily. So Malta went one step further than the various laundries and homes of the whole island of Ireland. They not only enslaved their women, but sent them across the sea to a neighbouring island so that there was absolutely no chance of escape. At least Irish women could get the boat and get over to England if they were lucky. So, like Ireland, the stories of these women, children, and conditions of becoming pregnant are only coming to light now, and it's very hard to get them discussed in Malta. There's no clear picture yet what happened to women once they delivered the children. So I look forward to going back again and finding out a little bit more. Has it actually progressed? I wrote Gozo and I wrote this into the novel. Next slide, please. I don't know if you can read that. The folklore of the island and what it says about women is very illuminating. I ended up using proverbs in multi at the beginning of every chapter. Can you actually see them?
Yes, we can.
You can read them. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So for example, and don't take my word for it that this is the way Maltese is pronounced, by the way. Deba blahiam tisfero tu tigaraf. The unfettered mare will slip her bridle and fall off the edge of the cliff. Mares here, and they're used very often in proverbs in Malta, they refer to girls or women. And a woman was to be kept in check and to be controlled. If she didn't behave as expected sexually, she might escape, become pregnant outside marriage, and fall off the edge of a cliff, banished from her community. So, where have we heard that before? I wonder. So, other examples like Mara blazach baltik bladak. If a woman is childless, it's not going to be a happy marriage. Another one is beware of a beware of a hen's foot, a pig's chin, and a woman's tongue. This struck me especially as Irish has an ancient tradition of grouping things in threes as well and using them to get a dig in at women. Usually they're the last one in the list. So, for instance, an old Irish saying would be the three worst things on the face of the earth: a hen's claw, a pig's snout, and a woman's tongue. So we see exactly the same thing in Malta. And the next one, please. This is another one. Every society has its prostitutes, whether they show off their profession or those who look pious and hide inside their gonella. So this is the theme of deception by women as expected, and innate unreliability and sexual dishonesty. And again, this runs through themes in Maltese proverbs. I actually spent quite a lot of time on this subject because I wanted to find out, was it actually true, or was this somebody just, putting forward a thesis? But it does seem to be true. And the next slide, please. Apart from folklore sources in Maltese, in Ireland, I was lucky to attend a conference on violence against women in the years 1916 to 1922. It has since come out as a book, and I really would recommend it thoroughly. There is an awful lot of work put into all the various chapters by various leading academics in the area, historians. Women's histories in pre and post-partition Ireland, like Maltese women's histories at the same period, were hidden. So investigation of newspaper reports unsealed archive material and examination and reappraisal of official sources do help to piece together some of the hidden histories of Irish women on the island of Ireland pre and post partition. And I would consider this to be one of the most important books that I have read in a very long time. For example, one thing that came up in that conference and in this book was shearing as a method of controlling troublesome women. Women of the period wore their hair long, and shearing was a way of shaming them. Men sheared off, cut off a woman's hair as a punishment, a warning, and as a warning to other women. Those of us of an age to remember also recall this method was used in the Troubles of 1969, extending to the 1990s. I can still remember myself. It was common to find a young woman tied to a lamppost, her hair cut off, and also her head tarred and feathered in the 60s, 70s, as a punishment for keeping company with someone from the other side, whatever side that might have been. Women were to submit and obey. In the early 20th century, the records allude to sheep shears being used rather than scissors in order to increase the shame for the woman and for her family, treating her like an animal. Very often, such women fled the family home for England and never returned. In Malta, many women fled to Sicily or also England because they were also part of the British Empire. Remember that. Rape was another item that came up in records of this time. It was never alluded to outright in the records of 100 years ago, but it was hinted at in newspaper reports. Women were chattels, and rape was a way of insulting the male owners of those chattels, husbands, fathers, brothers. The women were incidental to be used and abused as a way of men getting at other men. They were unimportant women. They were incidental. And again, I brought this up in the novel. And very obviously, people still say to me, my goodness, is this all your grandmother? And I have to turn around and go, it's fiction. I meant to spend a year on the research phase of this novel. I spent nearly 2 years consumed by examining crimes against women and how they were reported in newspaper reports, and also trying to get material on Maltese women as well. Rapes and assaults were hidden in plain sight in Ireland due to political upheaval. Virginity was used as a bridle and a whip to control young women in Ireland and in Malta. Pregnancy was categorized and stigmatized if it didn't fall into the right category in both countries. Women were told to cover their bodies because men couldn't be expected to control their own bodies in both countries. Items of wealth to be counted, like sheep or goats, not own both countries. And that is where my granny brought me in my research. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. Next up, we have Dr. Louisa Parker, aka Una, and her paper is on writing and drawing to improve understanding of misogyny and sexual violence.
Hi. Yeah, I'm always wearing two hats. So this is the one me. This is the me behind the scenes, the researcher and sometimes teacher. You can see that it's fairly typical stuff, really. I look at life stories. I trained in fine art. My PhD is in fine art practice. I looked at older women's life stories, mostly sort of people who were the same age as my mum, because I wanted to think about the generation before me that had lived both sides of the legislation of the 1970s. So it was a kind of combination of feminism and life story and drawing work. You can see this is the other me. It's still me, but this is the artist and writer that emerged from the chrysalis of publishing Becoming Unbecoming, which is this book. So you can see here that what I do is typical of most freelance artists, but in other ways, it's not typical at all. There's a reason I'm called Una, and that's because my second language is Spanish, and Una means one among many. That's what my Spanish edition's called, and all the different editions of Becoming Unbecoming play on the word one among many, dedicated to all the others, one of them, and so on. So that Una, that persona that was that emerged in 2015, quite late on in my career, became another me, but a really important part of me. And I just want to read to you something that a graduate essay, the winner of a graduate essay contest, Sarah Hildebrand, wrote about Una for the website Public Books. I can send the link later if anybody's interested in reading it. It's a really interesting essay. She says that she'd wanted words to fix her as a literature student, but it was images that pieced her back together. She says, Una's discretion in regards to her own experiences, even her identity, made me realise that my story is not for someone else's entertainment, and that even in silence, I can find solidarity. And she goes on to say, she dedicated her book to all the others. It's the first book I ever read that was dedicated to me. So this is my first graphic novel. It took 7 years to draw and research. This is partly because I needed to go to the archives at Leeds Central Library and read every issue, not every word, but every issue of the Yorkshire Evening Post that was printed between 1975 and 1981, so that I could see for myself what the representation of the hunt for Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, actually consisted of, because I was personally too young to really have taken it in. But I was aware that it might have influenced not only my worldview, but my view of myself, because at the time I was being serially sexually abused by predatory men. I was shunned and shamed for that. Fortunately, no one tied me to a lamppost and shaved my hair, but things were sufficiently bad that I needed to leave my village at the age of 16 and go and live with an older friend who I'd met at art school. And I changed my name and I never looked back. So Becoming Unbecoming is a really kind of important and powerful story. This is why it's been translated so much. This is why it's taught in universities across Canada and the USA. This is why in the lockdown, people in South America got in touch with me and said, could you put something on YouTube, because all our books are locked up in the school, and we were halfway through studying it and so on. And this is why a group of Brazilian people have made it into a play, and they take it around the workers' town of Mauá outside Sao Paulo into the favelas, all free performances, all not for profit. It's because so many people relate to what's in that book. And this makes me really sad, because so many people shouldn't relate to what's in the book. But it also has been really life-affirming, and it's amazing to have collected so many people along the journey of publishing this funny little book, which is about a 10-year-old girl living in Leeds with strange pictures, which you can see in the next slide. So most of this is fairly metaphoric. It's quite direct and honest, but despite the fact that the book is about child sexual abuse, domestic violence, which I also was happening around me in my house, the serial murder of women around Leeds, there's no direct depictions of violence. There are points of puncture, I like to think of them, which might make you sort of think or stop or gasp, but there's no spectacle. It's a combination of social history and personal history, as you can see from these two slides. One being me, I soon learned to lower my gaze, and the other being the maps of Yorkshire with descriptions of the first attacks and murders committed by Peter Sutcliffe. This is a page which has come up on the left. You can see the paper dollies, and I've given a lot of talks all around the world, and I'm amazed at how often this image comes up with artists who share similar experiences to mine. On the right-hand page, you can see the final page before the book goes into its ending, which is, because it's a kind of speculative, fictionalized, what if the world was different? What if things ended like this? The book ends with the 13 portraits of the 13 murdered women, containing in the portrait as much information as I could find out about them, which usually wasn't very much. So I had to reimagine their lives as if they had survived to be middle-aged women like me. And this penultimate page says, too many girls have to fight in silence, alone, to stay afloat, because of the trouble that can't be named. Mostly we muddle through, and some are not so lucky. 13 women lost their lives to one man while I was growing up. There is no memorial to them. They exist only in the memories of their loved ones, or as blurry mugshots in the numerous books and websites that are made by people fascinated by the man who killed them. One of many. I wonder what they would be doing now. Becoming Unbecoming isn't the only book that I've written about female friendship, solidarity, and violence. The Cree, which the New Writing North wanted me to change the title to Cree, but it will always be The Cree in my head, is it's Durham slang, County Durham slang for a place where you keep birds. And so the women's shed, which exists in Stanley in County Durham, where women get gathered to craft and just look after each other, is called The Cree, because that's funny, you know, because women are birds. The book is structured, just a short novel, and it was commissioned especially for me to work with this group of women, and I joined in with their classes and kind of hung around in Stanley for a little while, rode about on the bus looking at the countryside. And a lot of the time when you're working on life stories and when you're working with communities, you kind of walk into someone's life and then you walk back out again. And so that's how the book's structured. And this character at the start here, you can see that she's standing there, but she walks into the book and she walks back out. And then each page has a mirror. So there are urban landscapes and there are beautiful countryside landscapes. But because she walks in and she gets on the bus and then she walks through the town centre and then she kind of goes into the shop. And in the centre of the shop, where all the action is, the centre of the book pulls out and folds out like this. I'm really, really proud of this because I think as a concept, it's quite interesting. It doesn't get a huge amount of attention. I think it should probably get more attention because this particular group of women have gone from just one of them having enough money to pay rent on a shop, on an empty shop on Stanley Town Street, Front Street, they call it, to now being a really quite a big organization with their own training rooms and cafe and got a garden, and you know, they win loads of prizes. I mean, they're incredible. They're called Just for Women, Be Creative, and they're based in Stanley in County Durham in the north of England. Another sort of major project on these themes was CSE principles, which clearly might be an obvious choice, I suppose, to kind of work with young people who've got some kind of experience of being sexually exploited. It was really, really interesting because all I had to do was kind of turn up once the research had been done and then sit down with the committee of young people and say, okay, so what does these principles that you've worked out about what you need from specialist services, what does that look like to you? And then we just drew lots of doodles and drank lots of tea in it, lots of biscuits. And then I went away and worked up these drawings based on what the committee of young people had proposed. This can still be found online, and there's a PowerPoint for use in safeguarding training and so on. So if anyone's interested, again, you know, just contact me. Very happy to receive emails and direct people to resources. So finally, I want to talk about my other two books, which are not particularly related. I just don't want to leave them out. So this is another short novel. This was a collaboration with my mother. It contains the first cartoon I ever drew, because I used to like other people's cartoons, and when I tried to draw them, they seemed to come out a bit rubbish. So for many years, I didn't really think comics were something I could do. And then someone told me that having a psychosis is like being trapped in a tunnel with both ends blocked and deciding to escape through the ceiling. And I thought, that's what's happening to my mum. And then I drew that, and that was the start of all of this. Still, maybe nearly 20 years later, and I'm still drawing comics. So this was my grandfather's house. He wasn't a rich man. It was very dilapidated, and he bought it after World War II for about £1,000. And that's where my mum grew up. So it's kind of part homage to the house and part mother and daughter talking about one particular day in my mum's illness and in her recovery. And we got an Arts Council grant and went out talking to people about this. And you can see that it's very architectural in its design. You can see here on the left, this is my mum and her twin brother having a fist fight on the stairs, sort of seen as a aerial view, and then from the side with the kind of fancy banister. And on the right, this is from a photograph that I still had of the house, of the tiled hallway, which as a very small child made a huge impression on me, because you're sort of closer to the ground. And then finally, this is my latest book, which is more of a fiction, and it's kind of about the end of the world, but it's still very based in the north. It's very carefully coloured to look like Yorkshire, with samples taken from photographs that I've taken while out walking, so that I could paint in Yorkshire colours, and then a lot of toing and froing with the printer to get it exactly right. That's everything that I do is things by Una on all of my socials and everything. So if you want to find me, that's how you find me. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Dr. Keisha Allen. She will present on the female body as the medium for reimagining the nation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I will be analyzing a work of speculative fiction. And it's interesting, as Una mentioned, the possibilities of imagining the what if and thinking about the what if outside of normative notions of nation and the world and women. So that's what I'll be talking about. I'm looking at a work of speculative fiction by Nalo Hopkinson. She is a Caribbean writer. I am from the Caribbean, and that's my area of interest. So I will begin. In Midnight Robber, Nalo Hopkinson reimagines Caribbean civilization in the future by creating an alternative socio-normative reality. Hopkinson invents a fantasy world of myth and magic by reimagining the past and pushing the boundaries of a possible future. Within Hopkinson's futuristic world, grounded in Caribbean myth and magic, maroonage, recognizable in Caribbean narratives because of the maroon figure of historical association. The maroon figure is the enslaved person who escaped slavery, is deployed by female characters to imagine and create alternatives to the normative docks of homeland. Avoiding boundaries of post-colonial nations and their revolutionary alternatives, Midnight Robber is set in the far future, where Granny Nanny's Marisho Corporation leaves Earth to forge a new society on planet Tuset. Hopkinson depicts a futuristic world run by a woman, Granny Nanny, a female sentient entity who wields her power by creating an alternative society grounded in practices of maroonage. So Hopkinson describes the colonial past in the Caribbean, as a cancerous blot, a space where women were victims of violence, where their bodies were objectified and commodified. And she reimagines the Caribbean space as a space where women are in control. There's a female leader creating this world devoid of violence. So Hopkinson is imagining a matriarchal world, a world where women are no longer victims of violence, but are sort of the source of new life and new beginnings on this planet. So she is speculating on the possibilities of female-centered notions of revolution. So Hopkinson employs speculative fiction to rewrite science fiction from the perspective of the marginal subject. Traditionally, the science fiction genre has seldom employed non-stereotypical characters from the African diaspora, preferring instead to repeat the racial conventions and formulative spaces of plantation literature. Black speculative writers reimagine science fiction from the perspective of the marginal subject to disrupt traditional notions of science fiction. And Hopkinson in particular, she claims that speculative fiction is a great place to walk the mirror and impel the reader to imagine things differently. And what she's doing with speculative fiction is impelling the reader to imagine a world without violence against women. And when we think of the importance of what she's doing in this text, we think of the Caribbean that's plagued by femicide, where women are killed because of their gender, they're killed because they live in patriarchal societies where men take advantage of women, control women's bodies, and the abuse of women's bodies is so prevalent in the Caribbean that Hopkinson tries to imagine something different. And I think her intervention is so important because of what's currently taking place in the Caribbean, where male leaders turn a blind eye to the violence against women, where women are victims, and the indiscriminate killing of women is again ignored. So she talks about the work of Caribbean writers, and it must reference the effects of colonization, because these effects of colonization continue today in the Caribbean, where women's bodies are still abused and women's bodies again are susceptible to violence. She says, speculative fiction allows me to experiment with the effects of this cancerous blot, to shrink it by setting worlds far in my future, or to explore paradigms it's created. She says, I can choose to sidestep it altogether into alternate history. Hopkinson illustrates how the Black diaspora provides fertile terrain for speculating about alternative worlds devoid of violence. Her narrative combines elements of science fiction with fantasy as she probes into possibilities of creating alternate worlds and imagining alternatives to gender-based violence. As I mentioned previously, Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber is set in the far future, where a woman, a female sentient entity, rules over the planet. Hopkinson's matriarchal world is patterned after the revolutionary tactics of Nanny of the Maroons. Nanny of the Maroons was this powerful female leader of enslaved women who escaped slavery and created her own alternative world. And Hopkinson is reimagining this historical figure in the future to imagine something different, a world where women are no longer plagued by femicide. So Hopkinson reimagines Nanny of the Maroons as a technological woman warrior who reinvents Caribbean civilization. Here, Hopkinson creates alternate history that foregrounds a Black female subject's capacity for survival rather than her oppression as sexual victim. So the female lead of the planet creates a peaceful and egalitarian society. So Hopkinson creates an alternative world that acknowledges woman as in matria instead of patria, dismantling legacies of violence and patriarchal structures inherited by male leaders who assume responsibility for the nation. In Hopkinson's text, the female characters take control over their own lives and reimagine the nation on their own terms. Again, Hopkinson focuses on the survival strategies of female leaders, using the female body as a source of resistance and a space of new life on this fictional planet. Commenting on the revolutionary power of the female body, Miriam Chansey notes that our bodies have been a source of commodification in art, the site of physical and sexual abuse under slavery and neocolonial structures. So it stands to reason that it's through our body we might gain a powerful sense of our identities. In the text, the planet Susin is kept peaceful under the panoptic gaze of a computer called Granny Nanny. Every citizen on the planet is implanted with an airbag, which allows them instant communication with the female lead of the planet. And Granny Nanny prevents crime and regulates human interaction. And she's seen as this big brother figure, but a reimagining of this big brother figure with a woman in control of this planet and ensuring that no one is a victim of violence. So in Hopkinson's text, the maternal body is a medium for constructing alternative socio-political realities. The maternal body is a seed that fertilizes the soil and gives birth to new life on planet Susin. So within this text, the female figure envisions this new world where women are no longer victims of violence, but a source of new life. In the text, Hopkinson illustrates how Granny Nanny's world is one where an egalitarian socio-political space is created, where she shields her people from oppressive forces of the outside world. As the text points out, she kept the nation worlds protected, guided, and guarded its people. She is intimately connected to the nation worlds she oversees. The tools, the machines, the buildings, even the earth itself unto Saint had been seeded with Granny Nanny's hands and her body. So the narrator portrays Granny Nanny's practices of maroonage as a means to a better life. Granny Nanny provides guidance for those who yearn for a more equitable society. The inhabitants address each other as compare to signal the fraternity that exists between them. In order to maintain a safe and peaceful environment devoid of violence, criminals and other deviants are sent to the prison planet by Granny Nanny and it's called New Halfway Tree and are prohibited from returning to planet Susin. So again, she creates this system where she sends those deviants who are perhaps susceptible to violent behavior to another planet. She describes New Halfway Tree, the prison planet, as the antithesis of planet Susin, where we send the thieves, the murderers, and the drifters, the ones who think the world must have something better for them, if they could only find what part it is. So the narrator dialogues with the reader, depicting New Halfway Tree as an oppressive space plagued by genocide. It is a planet of social deviance where exile live without the possibility of Granny Nanny's guidance, and they succumb to greed and lust and violence. So the narrator juxtaposes the planet Susin with New Halfway Tree to illustrate how Granny Nanny's web creates a safer, more peaceful environment, whereas the prison planet is plagued by genocide and violence. So Granny Nanny weaves her protective web over the populace, and the text suggests alternatives to the normative homeland by imagining matriarchal worlds devoid of violence. So Hopkinson depicts women actively taking control over their circumstances, confronting oppressive attitudes, and dismantling colonial legacies of gender-based violence to impel the reader to imagine alternatives to oppressive geopolitical spaces. Thank you.
And finally, in person, we have Dr. Nazia Akhtar, Assistant Professor, and her paper is on Hatred, Violence and Humanity, the Surrender of a Young Girl in the 18th Parallel.
Decolonization and freedom from British colonial rule, which had persisted for the better part of 2 centuries in the Indian subcontinent, was accompanied by the partition of India in 1947. India was divided into India, West Pakistan, and East Pakistan on the basis of the two-nation theory, which stated that Hindus and Muslims were fundamentally incompatible and could not live together, despite a millennium and a half of historical evidence to the contrary. The partition, which is also called the transfer of power, was accompanied by great communal or sectarian violence between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed or displaced. Specific gendered violence against girls and women was also characteristic of this period. a conservative estimate of the number of Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh women who were raped and abducted stands at 100,000. And this number keeps shifting because the new states of India and Pakistan were simply not prepared to, not prepared for the scale of this catastrophe, and did not have the bureaucratic apparatus ready to record things. So we have various records and wildly varying figures. This situation was true not only of British India, that is, the territories directly administered by the British, but also many princely states, which were ruled by Indian royal families and indirectly interfered in, let's say, by the British. At the time of partition, the Indian subcontinent had no less than 565 princely states, and the rulers of most of these states had agreed to accede to either of the two new states, India or Pakistan, giving up their sovereignty in favor of democratic representative government. Among the handful of states whose rulers were holding out was Hyderabad, which is south central India, if you can just look at that bit. So just to give you a sense of scale, Hyderabad state was the largest princely state. It was about the size of France. So Hyderabad acceded to India only in 1948, and violent upheavals had intensified there around 1946 and continued well into the early 1950s. Okay, that works, great. For a long time, historiography failed the people of the Indian subcontinent. Historians dealt only with questions pertaining to the blame game: who was responsible for partition, whose fault was the violence and chaos, whom should we blame for the refugee crisis, whom do we hold accountable for the breakdown of India's syncretic and pluralist culture, etc., etc. It was literature that depicted the human dimensions of partition: conflict of selfhood and individuality, the crises of community and belonging, the patriarchal dimensions of communalism and its violence, etc. This is no different in the case of Hyderabad. In this paper, I examine the representation of violence against girls and women during the transfer of power in princely Hyderabad state in a novella called The 18th Parallel by Tamil language writer Ashoka Mitran. In particular, I focus on one moment in the text. I do have to provide a lot of background because of the nature of my work, but the scene I'm going to focus on, I argue, represents not only the cost that girls and women incur during communal violence as sites of family and community identity and honor, but also the impossible burden they carry as keepers of our shared humanity. The 18th Parallel is set in Sikandrabad, which is a military town attached to Hyderabad city, which was the capital of Hyderabad state. The text draws considerably from the author's own experience of growing up in 1940s Sikandrabad and may be considered a disguised memoir. It is here that Ashoka Mitran spent his childhood and teenage against the backdrop of transformative upheavals taking place during the transfer of power, and it is here that he sets the childhood and teenage of the adolescent Chandru, a Tamil Hindu boy who lives with his family in a residential colony meant for railway employees. The residents of Lancer Barracks are lower middle class railway employees and other lower middle class and working class people. Among them are Urdu speaking Muslims, Tamil speaking Hindu and Christian migrant families like Chandru's, and Anglo-Indian Christian families. The Deccan region, of which the princely state of Hyderabad was a part, had been home to an exemplary syncretic and plural culture for centuries. I don't have time to go into these images in particular, but they're syncretic images that combine and showcase the pluralist culture of the Deccan, because they merge Hindu, Muslim, and various other kinds of influences and images in them. So the Deccan had been home to this exemplary plural culture for centuries. People of different ethnicities, languages, and races had migrated and flourished in this highly cosmopolitan and globally connected region, And it was only in the mid-20th century that widespread polarizations arose between Hindus and Muslims. This polarization is visible in the games played in Ashoka Mitran's novella by the children of Lancer barracks, who imitate the conduct of the adults around them. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. Yeah, okay, so I can just quickly go over this. So this polarization, you see different groups of children playing together, and it's actually different groups of boys. The girls, incidentally, are not on the playground, and we can talk about this, I hope, during the discussion. So Urdu-speaking Muslim boys dominate the playground, right? Because they see themselves reflected in the state. So this is a princely state where Urdu is the official language, where the ruler is Muslim and is increasingly being seen as a representative of Muslimness in the Deccan. There are English-speaking Anglo-Indian children who exert racial and linguistic superiority on account of both language and race. But nevertheless, all these boys manage to play together. But micro-minorities like the Tamil migrants who are not local have to adjust to this pecking order. In spite of this, Chandru has a fairly happy childhood and manages to make friends with other boys. The girls are fascinating, but you can't really make friends with them. He does, however, he's not indifferent to the differences that he sees between himself and others when it comes to class or language or religion, and this will form a part of his transformation over a period of time. An important trope in the text is Chandru's bicycle, on which he sees the world flitting by like a panorama, which stimulates his thoughts about the changing contours, demographics, and developments in the city. He performs his role as outsider, bystander, and migrant, not being able to speak any of the local languages initially, and not belonging to any of the city's prominent cultural groups. He performs this role most effectively when he's riding his bicycle, this role as outsider and migrant and bystander. It enables his travel through time, space, and history as he watches people, events, and processes in progress. As he traverses the city, Chandru is swept into democratic protests and nationalistic acts of assertion, almost in a comical way, simply by virtue of being present at a particular place at a particular time. At no point does he appear to have well-defined political convictions, but as the text proceeds, his perceptions and attitudes undergo a radical transformation as he goes from being a naive and politically indifferent bystander to becoming an interested party. He develops a decided hatred towards Muslims. For example, when Mahatma Gandhi is assassinated, and the text covers this with great poignancy, Chandru, who of course knows the great man only through radio broadcasts and newspapers, resolves to kill Muslims, and I quote, as many as possible, end quote, if it is found that the assassin was a Muslim. It was not, as it turns out. As things worsen in Hyderabad and Sikandrabad, Chandru witnesses the violence between different groups of Muslims and Hindus and watches the coexistence of people in his neighborhood fall apart. The accession of Hyderabad to what was then called the Indian Union or India took place through an armed invasion of Hyderabad by Indian forces because the Nizam, the Muslim princely ruler of Hyderabad, had refused to accede. Like everywhere else, the transfer of power created tens of thousands of refugees in Hyderabad. Terrified groups of Hindus and Muslims had entered or left the borders of Hyderabad throughout the late 1940s, hoping to escape violence and dispossession. Following the invasion of Hyderabad, Chandru is out and about yet again on his bicycle and comes across a mob that is attacking the precarious huts and other temporary dwellings of Muslim refugees. The atmosphere in Hyderabad and Sikandrabad is one of terror and fear. as Muslims expect retribution and repression from both arms and apparatuses of the Indian state, as well as local Hindus who they think will seize the opportunity to exact revenge. Finding himself being chased by a bloodthirsty mob whose identity, Hindu or Muslim, he cannot tell, Chandru barges into a hut to seek refuge. Here he finds a Muslim refugee family crouching in fear. And this is how the scene is described. The people in the house had obviously discussed this eventuality and had prepared for it in advance. From among the group of women, a girl of about 16 came forward and stood before Chandru. She said, "Please spare us, I implore you." Even as she spoke, she started to unbutton her dress. She took off her long kameez. In a second, she had untied the knots of her pajama strings, and now she stood before him naked. Even in the dim light, one could count the ribs sticking out of her emaciated body. End quote. Chandru screams and runs away, his head reeling. We are told that even the burnt down shacks of the refugees had not affected him so. But this girl and his first glimpse of a naked female body had devastated him. She had abased herself and by her act had reduced him to nothing. Such self-abasement for the sake of her family, she herself was no more than a child. It seemed that in this world, no one was exempt from degradation, not even children. This was the price they had to pay for their survival. It is with his flight from the scene that the novella ends somewhat abruptly. In offering her body to Chandru to violate, the young girl surrenders not only her dignity, but her very humanity. In the process, she also strips him of his dignity as well as humanity, for she communicates to him through her gesture that he is not human to her anymore. She implies that in the process of objectifying her, he too becomes an object, devoid of humanity and empathy. In surrendering her humanity then, she is also confiscating his and reminding him of what he is in danger of becoming. It is because of this realization that Chandru flees, terrified that he could merit such a reaction from these destitute and desperate people. This trope of a young girl undressing in this manner is not new to partition literature. Saadat Hasan Manto, one of partition's most renowned storytellers, wrote an Urdu story called Khol Do, which means open it, which concentrates on the trauma experienced by a young rape survivor who automatically reaches for the cord girdling her shalwar when her doctor asks for the window in his surgery to be opened. In the context of the 18th parallel, the cost at which Chandru's tattered humanity is restored involves the terrible bargain that the young girl tries to negotiate with him, involving the complete surrender of her body to protect her family. What does Ashoka Mitran mean by ending a book that charts the coming of age of a young boy on this note? After all, this is not a book particularly interested in gender or the fate of women or girls. And besides the commentary that I've already quoted, Ashoka Mitran does not give us more ways or context to read it. This is the end of the novella. This then is its sum. I believe that the purpose of this novella is not only to be a coming-of-age text, but also to issue a warning about what communalism does not only to communities, but the damage and trauma it unleashes on the individual psyche of girls and boys, women and men. It is focused on Chandru's descent into a person driven by hatred and prejudice, and what it takes to restore him to some condition of being beyond that terrible state. Chandru is damaged by his experiences of the communal upheavals in Hyderabad, and ultimately it takes a young girl's surrender of her own humanity and dignity and the damage that she wreaks over herself to remind Chandru of how lost he has become. In doing so, she holds a mirror up to him, to the masculine Indian self, and to the nation that awakens, as Jawaharlal Nehru put it, to life and freedom at the midnight hour. Ashokamitran's vision of the new India is grim. He demonstrates how the violence through which it is birthed is transformative and reprograms not only communities but also individuals. In the process, most crucially for our present purpose, Ashokamitran is also saying something fundamental about the place of girls and women in this new nation. Feminist historians and anthropologists such as Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, and Veena Das have established that the bodies of girls and women became the sites on which battles between communities and nations came to be fought. The first visible rays of dawn that Chandru sees as he runs away from the hut, where the young girl had pleaded with him for her family's safety, represent the uncertain beginnings of the Indian nation amid such violence. This raises many questions. Who is the normative citizen of this country, Chandru or the teenage refugee girl? What is the place of India's girls and women in the historical imagination of the nation? Who bears the burdens of the freedom of this country? Who bears the scars of its awakening? Does the masculine national conscience too have to be played out on the emaciated bodies of girls and women? Who negotiates the tricky question of Muslim belonging, the pact of second-class citizenship? These questions that are raised by a text published in 1977 remain relevant for Indians and Hyderabadis today, as we live in a majoritarian country where the citizenship and belonging of different groups, minorities and women, remain conditional and precarious, where violence is a form of political action on the part of the state as well as its supporters. Thank you.